Here's that totally cool picture again. And in this section, we are going to talk about different types of neurons. You can categorize neurons either by their structure or by their function. And let's talk about each of these. Right? You can have a bipolar neuron, you can have a unipolar neuron, or you can have a multipolar neuron. And we've seen multipolar neurons because that's the type of neuron we were looking at when we were looking at nervous tissue when we were in the histology section of this class. So unipolar neurons have basically one long process. The cell body is off to the side. One end of that process is going to act like dendrites, and the other end of that process is going to act like an axon. This will be most sensory neurons in the peripheral nervous system. Some of these guys, the axons, may actually be a meter or longer. So if you think about getting sensory input from one of those basketball players who's 7.5 feet tall, they have to have axons that are running up their lower extremity and reaching up towards the spinal cord. So sure enough, axons may extend a meter or more. The longest carry sensations from your toes up to the spinal cord. Pretty cool, huh? Here's a bipolar neuron, which means you have a cell body and you have two processes associated with that cell body. One of those processes will act like dendrites, and the other process is going to act like an axon. These are relatively rare. You will find them in the structures that are associated with special senses. So I would know that if I were you. These are associated with structures that are associated with the special senses. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the special senses. Here are our friends, the multipolar neurons. You have a bunch of dendrites attaching to the cell body, and they have a single axon. They are the most common neuron in the central nervous system. And all motor neurons to skeletal muscles are multipolar neurons. They can also be as long as unipolar neurons, right? So they can carry information. A single one can carry information from the spinal cord out to the muscles that are going to help you move your toes. So when you're wiggling your toes, that information is being carried along an axon that runs down the back of your leg. Fascinating. We can also, as I mentioned, categorize neurons by function. Sensory, interneurons, and motor neurons. You already know what motor neurons are because we've talked about them when we talked about the neuromuscular junction. Sensory neurons are carrying sensory information, and they will only bring information up towards the central nervous system. About 10 million of those. I'm not going to ask you how many, but there they are. The majority of your neurons, which are going to be multipolar neurons, by structure, are in your central nervous system, in your brain and in your spinal cord. And look at how many there are. Billions and billions. These neurons are going to be what are known as association or integration neurons. And of course, motor neurons are going to carry motor information from the central nervous system out to the periphery. Let's talk a little bit about sensory receptors. Their job, of course, is to pick up information. They're going to detect stimuli. They will be processes of sensory neurons or cells that are going to be monitored by sensory neurons. And let's talk about a few different types. Interoreceptors, intero for within, will monitor your organs and structures and systems within the body. So they can detect distension, they can detect deep pressure, they can detect pain. Proprioceptors are going to help monitor where you are in space. So when you talk about proprioception, you're talking about information from skeletal muscles. So what does that mean, where you are in space? It means at any given nanosecond, you know if you're sitting, you know where your arms and legs are, you know where they are relative to the floor, whether relative to the chair that you're sitting in or your desk you're standing by, you know where your limbs and your torso are. You can lose that ability. If you have a disease like Huntington's, you start to lose your ability to detect proprioceptive information. So this is actually very important. External receptors are, of course, going to bring information about the external environment, temperature, pressure, vibration, light, touch, etc., as well as input for our special senses. External for outside or without. So there you have it. 3 major categories. And of course, there are going to be categories or receptors within each category. Now, let's go over some fibers associated with neurons. Afferent fibers are going to be carrying sensory information towards the CNS because sensory and afferent always go hand in hand. You're going to hear this term ganglion. If you hear ganglion or ganglia, which is plural of ganglion, you have a collection of neuronal cell bodies in the PNS. So when you hear the term dorsal root ganglion, you are outside of the CNS and you are a cell body that's hanging out in the PNS. Sensory neurons, we know that they're mostly unipolar neurons in the peripheral nervous system. They will have cell bodies in sensory ganglia. Somatic or somatosensory neurons are going to be monitoring the outside world as well as proprioception. The visceral sensory neurons are going to be monitoring what's happening within your body. Interneurons, we know, are within the CNS. They are usually found in between sensory neurons and motor neurons. They take in information from the peripheral nervous system or their neighbors within the CNS, and they are also going to be associated with the so-called higher functions like memory and like learning. We know we have to have motor neurons. There will be 2 types. Somatic motor neurons, which are going to provide information to skeletal muscles. You have conscious control over those. The cell body of these guys are going to lie within the central nervous system. The axon will extend out through a peripheral nerve, which is a bundle of axons in the PNS. You will also have visceral motor neurons. Of course you do. They are going to be associated with the autonomic nervous system, both or, I should say either or, the parasympathetic or the sympathetic division. They will innervate all of the other effectors, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle glands, and then they throw in adipose tissue. They are located sometimes in the PNS, sometimes in the CNS.